lands where we can see them now. The Coast Guard's order shattered the quiet as three armed agents boarded the small fishing boat. Guns aimed at the old man's chest. He stood barefoot on the deck, calm, silent, steady. They tore through his gear, trampled a photo of a woman, and ripped open compartments. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked softly. "Search everything," the leader barked. But the old man didn't flinch. Then the radio crackled. "Stand down. That's Captain Samuel Hart, Medal of Honor. Navy Cross. Step away immediately." Silence fell. And just like that, everything changed. They weren't searching a suspect. They were standing on the deck of a war hero, and they'd never forget how wrong they were. Samuel Hart wakes up each morning with the sunrise. No alarms, no agenda. Just the rhythm of the tide, the smell of salt on the breeze, and the familiar creak of his weathered dock stretching into the Gulf. At 81, his body moves slower, but there's a quiet precision in everything he does. Coiling ropes, prepping tackle, pouring a cup of black coffee into a dented thermos he's had since 1968. To the locals along the Florida Panhandle, Samuel is known simply as Old Man Hart, the man with the quiet eyes and a green cray boat named Annie after his late wife. He rarely speaks unless spoken to, and even then his words are measured, thoughtful. No one has ever seen him with a smartphone. He doesn't own a television, barely checks the weather. He reads the sky the way others read the news. He's a ghost, some say, a polite one. Always nods when he passes by. Doesn't wave, doesn't linger. You could live next to him for years and still know nothing about him. That's how he likes it. But behind that silence is a man forged in fire. Samuel Hart joined the Navy at 17, lied about his age just to get in. His first deployment was in the rivers of Vietnam, where he served on swift boats patrolling the Mekong Delta. He earned his first commendation pulling 2 wounded men from a capsized patrol craft under machine gun fire. That was just the beginning. Over the decades, he rose through the ranks quietly, steadily. By the Gulf War, he was commanding logistics and search and rescue operations in hostile territory. He was respected not because he demanded it, but because he embodied it. The kind of officer who stayed last on the field. The kind who never raised his voice but never had to. When his wife Annie passed away in her sleep 8 years ago, something in him shut down. No children, no extended family. Just a few handwritten letters tucked in a box and one photograph he keeps on the dash of his boat. After the funeral, he packed his uniforms in a trunk, stored his medals in a drawer, and left his service record untouched. His name rarely comes up, even among veterans. He never asked for recognition, and frankly, he never needed it. Fishing became his retreat, not for sport, but for solitude. Always in the same stretch of water off the coast. Always before sunrise. Locals joke that the fish come to him out of respect. And maybe in some poetic way they do. To most, Samuel Hart is just another aging widower drifting through the final chapters of his life. But those who served under him remember differently. To them, he's not just a man, he's a legend. One who never asked for a spotlight, but who one morning would find it pointed straight at him. The sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Captain Samuel Hart stepped onto his dock. The wooden planks, worn smooth by years of salt and sun, creaked under his boots just like they always did. He moved deliberately, first untying the tarp from Annie, the old 1987 cray he'd rebuilt himself, then checking the engine oil, inspecting the hooks, brushing sand off the bait box. Routine brought him comfort. It was the one thing war had taught him: ritual can keep a man sane. As always, he carried his battered metal thermos filled with strong black coffee. No cream, no sugar. Just heat and bitterness, something he could still control. He poured a small amount into the lid and stood at the edge of the dock, watching the sky turn from violet to copper. In the distance, gulls wheeled above the water, calling out like old friends. For Hart, this was the only kind of peace left that didn't come with a price. He cast off just as the water turned golden. The boat glided smoothly, its motor humming like a tuned string. He always went to the same spot about a mile out, where the sea deepened just enough to bring in larger fish, but still let him see the coast if he turned around. That morning, the water was still as glass. No waves, just the lazy lift of the tide and the occasional flick of silver beneath the surface. He had just anchored, just lifted the rod from its mount, when he noticed something strange. A vessel on the horizon. Big, gray, military lines, moving slowly but steadily in his direction. Hart narrowed his eyes. The Coast Guard didn't usually patrol this stretch, not unless something was wrong. He reached for his binoculars and peered across the water. There it was, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter, its deck busy with movement. Men in dark uniforms, tactical vests, a mounted light weapon on the bow. Then the engine sound shifted. It was accelerating, coming in faster now. Hart set down his coffee. His posture straightened, not with panic, but with muscle memory. He knew posturing when he saw it. This wasn't a casual check-in. Something was happening. He didn't have to wait long. A voice blared from the cutter's loudspeaker flat and mechanical fishing vessel. "This is the United States Coast Guard. Cut your engine and keep your hands where we can see them." Hart didn't move at first. He looked down at his hands, rough-weathered steady. Then he looked back at the cutter, now close enough that its bow waves rocked his boat. He calmly cut the engine and raised his hands, resting them lightly on the top of his head. His face remained unreadable, eyes steady. 3 officers leapt aboard in quick succession, boots slamming on the deck. One held a rifle. The other 2 moved with tactical precision, fanning out and scanning every surface. The lead officer, a younger man with a tight jaw and mirrored sunglasses, stepped forward. "Name he," barked. Hart responded evenly. "Samuel Hart." The officer didn't acknowledge it. "We received intel suggesting this vessel may be involved in transporting restricted items. We are authorized to conduct a full search under maritime enforcement statute." Hart didn't protest. He simply asked, "Is there a problem?" Officers search everything the lead agent said, not answering the question. And they did. They started at the helm, pulling open compartments, yanking out ropes, flipping over tackle boxes. A cup of bait spilled across the deck. The old thermos rolled and clanged against the gunwale. One officer knocked over the small photograph that had always rested on the dashboard, Annie smiling in the late afternoon sun, taken 30 years ago in Pensacola. The frame cracked as it hit the floor. Still, Hart said nothing. The other officer muttered, "This is perfect for smuggling, old man, old boat, who'd suspect it." The third agent opened the fish locker empty, except for one red snapper. He slammed it shut and moved on. To them, it was just a routine search. To Hart, it was something different. Not because of what they were doing, but because of how familiar it felt. The tone, the invasion, the suspicion. It was a ghost from the past wearing a different uniform. But he stayed calm. Not out of pride, but discipline. That's what war taught him. He'd been under real interrogation before. This was just noise. Still, as he watched them overturn his life piece by piece, one thought drifted through his mind. Something must have gone terribly wrong on their end, because they had no idea who they were dealing with. Petty Officer Michael Kincaid gripped his notepad tightly as he reviewed the dispatch information once more. Coordinates, time-stamp, vessel description. It all pointed to this exact spot on the map. A 24-foot fishing boat, solo operator, suspected smuggling operation, possibly weapons. It had come from a supposedly reliable tip, anonymous but specific, enough to activate a fast response team. And now here they were standing on the deck of a quiet, unarmed man's boat, and nothing was adding up. "Name again," Kincaid asked, this time with more emphasis. The old man repeated without flinching, "Samuel Hart." Kincaid made a mark on his notepad, eyes scanning the deck. He motioned for one of his men to continue searching the console. "Sir, we received a tip. You were identified at these exact coordinates, suspected of transporting illegal firearms. Do you have anything you'd like to tell us before we escalate this further?" Hart's expression didn't shift. No panic, no argument. Just a calm, nearly whispered response. "You're looking in the wrong place." It wasn't defiance. It was a statement of fact. The kind that carried weight not because it was loud, but because it came from someone used to speaking only when it mattered. To Kincaid, that made it worse. Most people get defensive in these situations. They protest, get flustered, start talking too much. Innocent people especially. They want to clear their name. But this man, he just stood there, like the whole thing didn't concern him. It put Kincaid on edge. He motioned for his team to widen the search. They pulled apart seat cushions, lifted every hatch, ran their hands behind wiring panels. One agent even unscrewed a bolted-down rod holder. Still nothing. The suspicion deepened. This kind of calm wasn't normal. Kincaid leaned in again. Mr. Hart, if that's your real name, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. You're not just out here with a fishing license. Our intel placed contraband on this exact boat. Exact coordinates. Same boat design. Single operator. If you're covering for someone now is the time to come clean. But Samuel Hart said nothing. He glanced down at the cracked photo of his late wife on the floor and gently picked it up. He wiped the glass with the sleeve of his shirt and returned it to the dash as if he hadn't just been accused of arms trafficking. That moment stuck with Kincaid. It wasn't arrogance, it was something deeper, like the man had already lived through far worse than this. One of the agents called out from the stern, nothing in the bilge, just old rope and rusted bolts. Check the engine casing, Kincaid snapped. Another few minutes passed, nothing. No false compartments, no odd welding seams, no suspicious containers. The agent with the radio turned back to Kincaid, still trying to get HQ to confirm ID. Signals bouncing. Kincaid stepped aside, voice lowered into his mic. Confirmed subject name Samuel Hart. Solo vessel at last pinged coordinates. Suspected in tip about firearms cache. Repeat, need urgent background match. Subject is non-compliant and unusually calm. Back on the boat, the team had run out of things to tear open. One of them muttered, "Either he's the best smuggler I've ever seen, or we really screwed this up." Kincaid glanced back at the old man, now sipping from the thermos they had knocked over earlier, completely unfazed. He felt something gnawing at the base of his stomach. Something wasn't right. Because deep down, for all the procedures and protocol, he knew this wasn't how guilt looked. This was how dignity stood. Petty Officer Kincaid stood at the edge of the boat, gripping the radio mic tighter than necessary. The waves slapped gently against the hull, steady, rhythmic, almost taunting. All around him, the search had gone cold. Every compartment was empty, every suspicion unfounded. But the man standing before him, too calm, too still, too wrong for this moment. "Headquarters, this is Neptune Team," Kincaid said into the mic, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "Requesting urgent ID confirmation. Subject name Samuel Hart, solo operator. Registration matches, but we need a full background. Any prior military criminal or flagged activity." There was a pause, a long one. On the water, 10 seconds of silence feels like 10 minutes. The crackle of static returned, then the voice of the communications tech. "Copy that, Neptune Team. Stand by for records pull." The team stood waiting. One officer adjusted his vest. Another tapped nervously at the edge of a seat. The old man Hart simply returned to his position at the helm. He'd righted his coffee thermos, repositioned his tackle box. Even picked up the cracked photo of his wife and set it back on the dash. Not once did he ask what they were doing. Not once did he look concerned. It made every man on board feel smaller. Then suddenly the radio popped louder this time. But the voice that followed wasn't from the comms tech. It was deeper, sharper. The tone of someone used to command. "Neptune Team, this is Commander Addison at Central Command. Step away from that vessel immediately." Kincaid frowned. "Say again, sir." The reply came without hesitation. "You've boarded Captain Samuel Hart, Medal of Honor recipient, Navy Cross, former commanding officer of Joint Naval Rescue Operations, Vietnam and Gulf War veteran." The radio hissed with residual static. Not a soul moved. Every officer aboard froze rifles, lowering slightly, eyes darting between each other in disbelief. Kincaid's face drained of color. His fingers went limp on the mic. "Sir, we had intel." The voice returned, steel-hard and unmistakable. "Your GPS coordinates were off. The actual target vessel was 6 miles southeast. It's already in custody. You've boarded the wrong boat and the wrong man." Silence. Not the tense silence of suspicion, but the heavy shame kind, the kind that settles on men who realize they've crossed a line they never should have approached. Kincaid looked at Hart. The old man hadn't moved. He simply sipped his coffee, watching the horizon the same way he likely did every morning. No victory in his eyes, no smug satisfaction, just stillness. And beneath that something else. A disappointment so quiet it cut deeper than any reprimand. Kincaid stepped back instinctively. "Captain Hart," he said, stumbling over the name now as if it burned. "Sir, we had no idea. We were operating on what we thought was." Hart didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of who he was already said everything. Another officer lowered his radio mouth slightly open as if trying to apologize, but unable to summon the words. "Captain," Kincaid tried again. "Please, accept my apologies. We never meant just return my license." Hart said, quiet but firm. The officer scrambled to collect the scattered documents, straightening the edges, before handing them back with trembling hands. Hart took them with a nod and turned back to the helm. Kincaid looked at his men. "Let's go. Put everything back." As they stepped off the boat one by one, no one spoke. No one looked the captain in the eye. And as the cutter pulled away, engines humming low, Samuel Hart sat alone once again on his quiet vessel. Same boat, same sea. But something had changed, not for him, for them. Long before he was an old man with a quiet boat and a rusted thermos, Samuel Hart was the kind of officer they wrote about in internal commendation reports, ones passed quietly between high-ranking desks, but never printed in newspapers. He never sought a spotlight, but his name echoed through corridors that mattered. It was 1970, the thick of the Vietnam War. River Patrol Section. Charlie was pinned down on a narrow stretch of the Mekong Delta, ambushed from both banks during a night reconnaissance. 11 sailors, most barely out of high school, lay scattered along the jungle shoreline, their patrol boats sinking and the air thick with rifle fire and smoke. Hart wasn't supposed to be there. He'd volunteered to escort a supply boat and had radioed in just minutes before the ambush. But when the call came through under fire, multiple wounded can extract, he didn't wait for orders. He gunned his small fiberglass patrol craft directly into the fight, weaving past submerged debris and incoming fire like it was nothing more than rain. The sailors never forgot what they saw. A lieutenant leaping from his boat, bleeding from the thigh, dragging one man, then another, 11 in total, each one thrown over his shoulder and dropped inside his own craft with only seconds between bursts of gunfire. He returned for the last two men, even after being clipped in the shoulder. When a medic later asked why he didn't wait for backup, Hart had simply said they wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes. He was awarded the Navy Cross for that rescue. A year later, he earned the Medal of Honor during an operation outside Saigon, where he shielded two of his men during a mortar strike and directed a counterattack despite having a shattered collarbone and bleeding lungs. But ask Samuel Hart about it now, and he'll just shrug. "I did my job," he might say. After Vietnam, he stayed in serving during the Gulf War in a leadership capacity. By then, he was a seasoned tactician, calm under pressure, fiercely loyal to his men, and never interested in promotion for its own sake. He turned down a Pentagon appointment twice. Instead, he chose command roles on the ground where he could still look the men in the eye. When the bullets finally stopped, Hart didn't retire into comfort. He began working with new recruits, training Navy search and rescue teams. He was hard but fair, expecting not perfection, but attention. "Listen to the wind before you speak," he used to say. "The sea always knows more than you do." Cadets would talk about him in hushed tones. The ones who survived their first storm thanks to his training, said Hart's voice echoed louder than the wind. He taught not only procedures, but instinct. "When something feels wrong, it probably is," he'd say. "Trust it, or someone dies." But the man who taught thousands to trust their gut began losing his footing the day Annie passed. It was sudden, a stroke in the early morning, while she made coffee in their little white kitchen back in Pensacola. They'd been married 43 years, no children, no extended family. Just her laughter in the kitchen, her quiet humming as she folded laundry, her hands in his every Sunday morning on the dock. After the funeral, Hart gave one final training session, then turned in his ID, his base clearance, and the apartment keys the Navy had always paid for. No farewell speech, no dinner, no plaque. He bought a small fixer-upper near the coast, rebuilt the old boat they once used for weekend trips, and named it Annie. Since then, he's been a ghost, a shadow drifting on the edge of the Gulf, always before dawn, always back before noon. The sea was quieter than the world, and that suited him just fine. What the Coast Guard agents saw that morning was just a glimpse. A man with a rod and a thermos. What they didn't see was the scar along his shoulder where shrapnel once tore through flesh. Or the silver coin he carries in his pocket, a gift from one of the 11 sailors he saved, engraved with the words, "Alive because of Hart." To them, he was just an old man on a boat. To those who knew, he was something else entirely, and he didn't need to prove it to anyone anymore. The next morning, just after sunrise, the same old dock creaked beneath Samuel Hart's boots. He moved as he always did, measured unhurried one step ahead of the wind. His thermos of black coffee sat in its usual place on the boat's dashboard. The ropes were coiled, the tackle checked the engine, humming softly. Another ordinary morning in the life of a man who wanted nothing more than peace. But this morning he wasn't alone. A vehicle pulled up quietly behind the house. Not a government SUV or patrol car, just a plain civilian sedan, with dust on the tires and a nervous young man stepping out. Petty Officer Michael Kincaid, the same officer who had boarded Hart's boat with suspicion in his eyes and a hand near his holster. Now he stood at the edge of the dock cap in his hand, looking smaller than his uniform made him appear. Hart saw him but said nothing. He simply continued checking the line on his spare rod. Captain Hart Kincaid called out, voice softer than yesterday. "Sir, may I have a word?" Hart didn't look up right away. He tied the line, clipped the hook, and then turned his weathered face lit by the rising sun. "I was wondering if I might join you today," Kincaid added. "If that's all right." Hart motioned to the spare rod. "You know how to tie a blood knot." Kincaid smiled faintly. "Not well. Then you'll learn." They pushed off together. No fanfare. No formal apology. Just the quiet rhythm of the waves and the slow churn of the boat's engine as it carried them back toward the same familiar patch of sea. It wasn't until they dropped anchor that Kincaid finally spoke. "My grandfather served in Korea," he said, eyes on the horizon. "3rd Infantry. Used to tell me stories about frozen rivers, rice paddies, foxholes so cold your hands stopped working. He was a stubborn old guy, cigarette behind the ear even in church." Hart gave a slight nod, listening. "He used to tell me, boy, always respect someone who's quiet in a crowd. They've probably seen something the rest of us haven't." Kincaid chuckled to himself. "I didn't really get it until yesterday." Hart cast his line with a clean, fluid motion. "He sounds like he knew what mattered." Kincaid sat for a moment watching the ripples. "I don't get it, though," he finally said. "Yesterday we stormed your boat with rifles, accused you of smuggling, treated you like a criminal. And you didn't even raise your voice. How do you stay that calm?" Hart reeled in, slightly adjusting the tension on the line. "Because I've seen what true chaos looks like," he said quietly. Kincaid turned to face him. Hart didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The line on his cheek, the crease near his eye, the stillness in his posture, they said everything. "In war," Hart continued, "you learn to listen to silence. It's the seconds before the shell hits that teach you the most. Panic wastes time. Anger clouds judgment. Calm, that saves lives." Kincaid nodded slowly. Words caught somewhere between understanding and regret. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said. "Not just for what we did, but for not knowing who you were, who you are." Hart smiled, faint but real. "I'm just a man trying to fish." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't feel awkward, just full. And when a fish finally tugged Kincaid's line, Hart leaned over and said, "Don't yank it. Let it come to you." And so he did. And somewhere between cast and catch, Michael Kincaid understood the difference between command and control, and the kind of strength that doesn't shout. The next morning came wrapped in a quiet mist, the kind that softened the world and made everything feel just a little more sacred. Down at the dock, Captain Samuel Hart stood as he always did, boots planted firmly on the worn boards, his old boat, Annie, swaying gently in the tide. The air smelled of salt rope and memories. From behind, footsteps approached. "Morning, sir," came a voice. It was Petty Officer Michael Kincaid again this time, in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt, holding a cup of gas station coffee in one hand and a small tackle box in the other. "If that second rod's still open, I was hoping we might try again. No uniforms this time. No radios." Hart looked up from his knots, took a long pause, then gave a quiet nod toward the boat. "Bring your own bait. Bought it on the way here. Still not sure what's best for snapper." Hart cracked the faintest smile. "That's all right. The fish don't care what you bring. They care how long you're willing to wait." They pushed off together this time, not in tension or silence, but in the quiet comfort of shared understanding. The boat hummed gently as it moved across the flat water, leaving a trail of ripples behind. Out near the usual spot, they dropped anchor. The sea stretched out in every direction, calm and glassy. Above them, gulls circled lazily. There was no rush, just time-space, and the gentle groan of the old boat as it settled into the current. Kincaid struggled a little with his line. Hart helped him adjust the weight, showed him how to feel the tension in the rod and where to watch for the pull. Patience, Hart said. Fishing's not about chasing, it's about waiting, listening. Most folks today don't know how to be still. That's why they miss things. Kincaid looked down at his hands. You always come out here alone since Annie passed, Hart replied. It's quieter this way. But lately, quiet feels different. They sat in the kind of silence that only exists between men who no longer feel the need to impress one another. Eventually, they spoke about war, about peace, about what had changed in the world and what never really does. Kincaid asked questions not about missions or medals, but about choices, about what it meant to walk away from everything and still feel whole. Hart answered simply with few words but deep meaning. There's power in not being known, he said, in being just the man on the water. An hour passed, then another. Neither of them caught a single fish. Still, neither of them seemed to mind. Kincaid broke the quiet again. You ever think about going back, letting people know who you are? Hart shook his head. I did what I needed to do. The rest isn't mine to chase. These days I just want to keep a clean deck and a quiet conscience. He looked out across the water, then back at Kincaid. You know, Hart said sometimes the ones you overlook are the ones you owe the most to. Kincaid swallowed that truth like a stone. He thought back to yesterday, his tone, his orders, his assumptions. Yeah, he said softly. I believe that now. As the sun crept higher in the sky and the wind shifted slightly, Hart reeled in his line and checked the bait. Let's try one more cast, he said. Fish or no fish, every day's a good one when you get a second chance. And they did. 2 men, 1 boat, drifting together not toward fish, but towards something far more rare, understanding. The morning wore on, gently, sun climbing higher, but still soft on the water. The 2 men fished in near silence, casting lines, reeling them and casting again. No hurry, no pressure, just the rhythm of the sea and the occasional call of a gull. Then finally a tug. Kincaid's rod bent ever so slightly. His eyes widened with the familiar rush of excitement, the instinct to yank and pull hard. Easy, Hart said calmly, not even looking up. Let it fight first. Kincaid did. He loosened his grip, gave the line a little slack, then reeled gently. A flash of silver broke the surface, a small snapper, maybe 10 inches long, flipping and glinting in the morning light. He raised it with both hands, holding it up like a small prize. Hart leaned in, eyes scanning the fish. Not ready, he said simply. Kincaid looked confused. It's legal size, isn't it? Maybe, but not by much. Let it grow, Hart said. That fish isn't ready yet, like most of us. The younger man paused, looking at the fish in his hands. Then slowly he knelt at the side of the boat and lowered it into the sea. The snapper floated there for a moment, stunned, before darting off with a flick of its tail. For a while, neither of them spoke. Kincaid sat back on the bench, eyes on the horizon. The boat rocked gently beneath him. He thought about what Hart had said, not just about the fish, but everything. The silence, the calm, the dignity and restraint, the strength it took to forgive. He realized this wasn't just a fishing trip. It was a passing of something older than tactics and training, something you didn't find in a manual or a briefing room, a kind of wisdom that couldn't be taught, only witnessed. He turned to look at Hart, who was coiling his line like he had 1,000 times before. Quiet, steady, at peace. Thanks for letting me come, Kincaid said softly. Hart nodded without turning. Most folks don't stay long enough to listen, and with that, the boat drifted a little farther into the stillness, leaving behind the fish, the memory, and a lesson carried quietly by the sea. Not every hero wears their story on their sleeve. Some, like Captain Samuel Hart, carry it in silence, in the way they speak gently, when others shout, in the way they forgive without being asked, and in the way they choose patience over pride. In today's world, where noise often drowns out wisdom, it's easy to overlook people like him. But maybe that's exactly why we need to slow down, to see who's standing quietly in the background, because often they're the ones who carried us through the storm. Hart's story isn't just about a mistaken search on a fishing boat. It's about grace, humility, and the quiet dignity of those who've already given more than their share. We all know someone like that, don't we? A grandfather who never spoke of his service, a neighbor who waves every morning but never asks for help, a stranger who shows unexpected kindness. So here's our question to you. Have you ever misjudged someone only to later realize how much they'd lived or how much they'd sacrificed? Or perhaps you've known someone like Hart, whose silence said more than words ever could. Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. We'd love to read them, and others will too. If this story touched you, please give it a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that respect is something earned, not demanded. Thank you for spending time with us today. And remember, some of the greatest lives ever lived are sitting quietly right next to us.